The HOA president live-streamed herself drinking from my ranch pond to 20,000 followers, calling it sacred community water, while my 18 bulls and 12 horses had been using it as their bathroom for 7 years. She was planning a 400-person purification ceremony for tomorrow morning, and I had 12 hours to decide whether to let them drink liquid manure or become the villain who destroyed their spiritual awakening. But this wasn't really about water rights or property boundaries. This was about power, control, and what happens when a grieving mother's pain transforms into something dark enough to poison an entire community. My name is Caspian Blackwater, and I've been raising cattle on this land in northern Colorado for 15 years. When Moonrise Meadows subdivision sprouted up like expensive mushrooms 2 miles from my property line, I figured we'd be good neighbors. The HOA president, Serafina Nightshade, had other plans. It started on a Tuesday morning in late September when I stepped onto my back porch with coffee and spotted what looked like a wellness retreat happening next to my livestock pond. 15 adults in flowing white clothes had arranged themselves in meditation circles around my water source, with professional photography equipment capturing their connection to nature. The ringleader was immediately obvious. Serafina stood center stage like some kind of environmental influencer, gesturing dramatically at my pond while explaining something to her followers. She had that particular brand of suburban authority that comes from never being told no. Perfectly styled blonde hair that somehow looked salon fresh despite allegedly camping outdoors. And one of those voices that carries just far enough to ensure everyone knows exactly how enlightened she is. I'd seen her around town, usually holding court at the farmer's market while loudly educating anyone within earshot about locally sourced this or organic that. But this morning, Serafina had decided my private property was her wellness sanctuary. She'd positioned herself where the morning sun hit the water just right, leading what appeared to be a sunrise meditation session. I watched in growing disbelief as she guided her flock through breathing exercises, encouraging them to breathe in the pure, untainted energy of this sacred water source. If she only knew, the irony was so thick I could spread it on toast. For 7 years, that beautiful pond had served as the primary bathroom facility for my entire herd. Every morning, my bulls and horses waded into that water to drink, cool off, and handle their biological necessities exactly the way nature intended. I walked over, still holding my coffee mug, trying to project casual friendliness rather than get the hell off my land. My 16-year-old daughter Willow was probably watching from her bedroom window, and she'd been through enough upheaval this year without seeing her dad lose his mind over confused neighbors. Morning, I called out, keeping my voice neighborly. Beautiful day for meditation. Serafina greeted me like I was a welcome addition to her outdoor adventure. Oh, wonderful, she practically sang, clasping her hands together. You must be Caspian. I'm Serafina Nightshade, president of the Moonrise Meadows Homeowners Association. We're so grateful you maintain this beautiful community space for everyone's enjoyment. Community space. The words hit like a cold slap. I think there's some misunderstanding. I said reasonably, this is private property. It's been in my family for 3 generations, and that pond is specifically designed for my livestock. I pointed toward the pasture where my cattle were gathering near the fence, wondering why their morning routine had been interrupted by what looked like a Pinterest board come to life. Serafina's smile never wavered, but something shifted behind her eyes like a computer processing unwanted information. She pulled out her phone with theatrical flourish and scrolled through official-looking documents. Actually, according to the original township survey from 1987, this area was designated as Community Watershed Access. She announced confidently, these property lines haven't been properly updated to reflect modern community needs. We've researched this extensively, and legally speaking, You cannot prevent public access to natural water resources that predate current residential development. The legal jargon was impressive. She delivered it with the kind of authority that probably worked great at HOA meetings when intimidating someone into trimming hedges to regulation height. But here's the thing about owning land your entire adult life. You get familiar with what's yours. I'd been paying property taxes on every square inch for 15 years, including the pond I'd had excavated and lined specifically for my animals. The idea that some 1987 survey somehow trumped my deed, tax records, and basic common sense was absurd. Before I could explain this, Serafina was typing rapidly on her phone while maintaining eye contact in that unsettling multitasking way. "I'm just sending out a quick update to our community network," she said casually. "We have about 800 families in our association, and they're always looking for opportunities to connect with nature. This is exactly the kind of hidden gem people need to know about." She hit send with a satisfied flourish. 800 families. The implications hit like a freight train, but Serafina was already pivoting, walking to what appeared to be a portable speaker system. "Everyone gather around the water's edge." She called in that commanding voice, suggesting she was used to being obeyed. "We're going to begin with a blessing for this beautiful gift of nature and the generous spirit of community sharing that makes moments like this possible." I stood there, coffee growing cold, watching 15 adults arrange themselves around my livestock pond like they were performing a sacred ritual. Someone had professional photography equipment. A woman in expensive yoga pants was doing unnecessary stretches. 2 guys were setting up a camping kitchen with a portable espresso machine. Because apparently roughing it required artisanal caffeine, the scene was so surreal I almost laughed. But then I caught sight of Willow's face in her bedroom window. And that expression reminded me, this wasn't just about me anymore. That evening, after Serafina's group had settled in for what appeared to be a long-term occupation, I sat on my back porch with a beer and tried to process what was happening. They'd upgraded their setup significantly since morning, adding what looked like a dining pavilion, multiple cooking stations, and enough solar panels to power a small village. Someone had installed a sound system currently playing acoustic guitar music at a volume that probably violated several noise ordinances, but somehow managed to sound wholesome and nature-loving. The next morning brought my first real indication of how serious this was getting. I woke up to find that Serafina's social media blitz had gone viral overnight. Her Instagram post about fighting water privatization in rural Colorado had been shared over 3,000 times, with comments ranging from supportive to absolutely venomous. "Typical rich rancher thinks he owns nature," wrote someone called Eco Warrior 2024. "This guy probably votes to drill in national parks too," added Green Mama 87. My personal favorite was from Tree Hugger Forever. "Hope his cows drink all his pond water and he learns what real thirst feels like." But the real gut punch came when I checked my email and found a message from Willow's school asking if I'd like to reconsider my volunteer position helping with their upcoming science fair. Several parents had expressed concerns about having someone involved who was currently involved in environmental disputes. Willow had been looking forward to that science fair for months. She'd already started working on her project about water quality testing. Now her dad was too controversial to help judge student presentations about volcanoes and solar systems. That afternoon, things escalated in ways I hadn't seen coming. Serafina held an impromptu press conference right there beside my pond, with local news crews positioned to capture her environmental justice message with my contaminated water as the backdrop. This represents everything wrong with how we think about natural resources in America. She announced to Channel 7's Weekend Reporter, "One person cannot monopolize what belongs to everyone. Water is life, and life cannot be privatized." The reporter, some eager young guy who probably thought he'd stumbled onto the next big environmental story, ate it up completely. "So you're saying Mr. Blackwater is preventing local families from accessing what should be public land. Serafina nodded gravely, explaining how she'd discovered, through extensive research, that this watershed had been designated for community use decades before current property lines were established. She painted me as some kind of land-grabbing villain who was stealing water from babies and orphans. I stood there, maybe 50 feet away, watching my reputation get demolished on live television, while a reporter who'd never bothered to fact-check anything nodded along sympathetically. The online reaction was everything Serafina could have hoped for, and everything I should have feared. Within hours, the Channel 7 clip had been shared over 5,000 times. The comments section was a masterclass in righteous indignation from people who knew absolutely nothing about the situation but were completely certain I was everything wrong with America. That evening, I got a call that changed the trajectory of everything. The voice was smooth and practiced, the kind that probably cost extra at law school. Mr. Blackwater, this is Marcus Ravencroft, attorney for Miss .5 Lee, Nightshade. I'm calling as a courtesy to inform you that we'll be filing an injunction tomorrow to prevent you from interfering with my client's legitimate use of the watershed area. When I tried to explain that I had clear title to the property, Ravencroft cut me off with legal jargon designed to make normal people feel stupid and overwhelmed. Property tax payments don't supersede historical easements and watershed designations, he said, like he was reading from a textbook. Your deed may cover surface rights, but water access predates current residential development. The conversation ended with Ravencroft informing me that any attempt to remove the camping group could result in additional legal action for harassment and violation of civil rights. Civil rights. Preventing strangers from turning my livestock pond into a summer camp was now equivalent to denying people their constitutional freedoms. Meanwhile, Serafina's operation was becoming more sophisticated by the day. She'd somehow acquired permits from somewhere, though I was pretty sure none of them covered using my property as a spiritual retreat center. Professional-grade tents replaced the original camping setup. A registration booth appeared where attendees could sign petitions supporting community water access rights and buy t-shirts that said, "Water belongs to everyone," with a picture that looked suspiciously like my pond. The whole thing felt like a cross between a protest rally and a music festival, which I supposed was exactly what Serafina was going for. That's when I called my neighbor Roy Patterson, a veterinarian who'd been dealing with livestock and water management longer than I'd been alive. If anyone could help me figure out a strategy for dealing with this insanity, it was him. We met at his clinic after hours, where he'd already pulled up some of the videos and articles about our situation. "This is worse than I thought," Roy said, scrolling through Serafina's blog posts. "They're not just attacking your property rights. They're trying to destroy your entire reputation. You need to start documenting everything. Caspian, every trespasser, every threat, every piece of misinformation they spread." Roy had a point. Serafina wasn't interested in finding a compromise or working out some reasonable solution. She was running a full-scale campaign to paint me as a villain, using every tool of modern social media warfare to turn public opinion against me. But before I could decide on a strategy, Roy asked a question that made my blood run cold. "Caspian," he said slowly, "when's the last time you had that pond water tested?" The truth was, I'd never had it tested. Why would I? It was a livestock pond, designed specifically for agricultural use. My animals had been thriving on it for 7 years. "Roy," I said, already knowing I wasn't going to like his answer, "what exactly are you thinking?" He pulled up a photo from Serafina's Instagram, showing families with young children gathered around my pond. "I'm thinking that if people are planning to drink this water, we better make damn sure we know what's in it." The implications hit me like a sledgehammer. For a week, I'd been watching this situation as a property rights issue, a battle between a rancher and an overreaching HOA president. But if Serafina was actually encouraging people to consume water that had been serving as a bathroom for 18 bulls and 12 horses, Roy, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, what happens if that water is contaminated and people get sick? His expression told me everything I needed to know before he said a word. Then you're not just dealing with trespassing and property disputes anymore. You're looking at potential criminal charges for reckless endangerment. Even if you never gave anyone permission to use the water, that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw images of children playing in contaminated water while their parents took pictures and talked about connecting with nature. I saw families sharing organic snacks beside a pond that might be a bacterial soup capable of hospitalizing anyone who consumed it. By morning, I'd made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing to fight this as a property dispute, I was going to find out exactly what we were dealing with. Roy had agreed to run comprehensive tests on the pond water, but it would take 48 hours to get results. 48 hours, while Serafina's Sacred Water Festival was scheduled to begin. I was standing on my back porch Thursday morning, watching the latest wave of festival preparations, when my phone buzzed with a call from Willow. "Dad," she said, and something in her voice made my stomach drop. "You need to see what I found." Willow had inherited her mother's investigative instincts, along with her technological expertise. While I'd been focused on the immediate crisis of people camping on my property, she'd been digging into Serafina's background. "Dad, her real name isn't Serafina Nightshade. It's Serafina Valdez Phoenix. And 3 years ago, her daughter drowned in a ranch pond about 50 miles from here." The world tilted on its axis. "What are you saying?" "Honey, I'm saying this isn't about water rights or environmental justice. This is about revenge. And Dad," her daughter's name was Luna. She was 14 years old, just like I was when Mom died. The pieces started falling into place with sickening clarity. A grieving mother who'd lost her teenager in a rural pond accident, a woman who'd spent 3 years planning something elaborate and personal, the excessive research into my family's property, the perfectly coordinated media campaign. Serafina wasn't an environmental activist who'd stumbled onto my property. She was a mother whose grief had curdled into something dark and calculating. Someone who'd chosen my ranch as the stage for whatever twisted form of justice she'd been planning. "Willow," I said, my voice steady despite the panic building in my chest, "I need you to keep digging. Find out everything you can about Luna's accident, about Serafina's background, about Phoenix development. And honey, don't let anyone know what you're researching." "Dad, there's something else." Phoenix Development LLC filed paperwork to purchase our ranch 6 months ago. The offer was for about 10% of the property's actual value, contingent on resolution of outstanding legal and environmental issues. She hadn't been trying to gain access to my pond. She'd been trying to force me into bankruptcy so she could buy my land for practically nothing. But why? What was the endgame? The answer came that afternoon in a way that made everything infinitely worse. Roy called with preliminary results from his water testing, and his voice carried the kind of horror usually reserved for natural disasters. "Caspian, you need to shut this down immediately. This water, Jesus Christ. I've never seen bacterial levels this high outside of a sewage treatment plant. E. coli levels were 400 times higher than what was considered safe for human contact. Coliform bacteria, parasites, nitrates from animal waste, the works. People weren't just risking stomach upset if they consumed this water. They were risking serious illness, kidney failure, potentially death." "Roy," I said, watching through binoculars as families continued arriving for tomorrow's festival, "people have been drinking this water for a week. Then we're looking at a potential mass casualty event. And Caspian? If this gets out and you didn't warn people," he didn't need to finish. I understood exactly what kind of legal and moral nightmare I was staring down. That evening, as I watched Serafina address her growing crowd of followers about tomorrow's sacred water ceremony, I realized I was trapped in an impossible situation. If I charged out there right now and started yelling about contaminated water, it would look like a desperate lie from someone trying to sabotage her successful event. After a week of being painted as the villain who wanted to deny water access to families, suddenly claiming the water was dangerous would seem like the most transparent excuse imaginable. But if I didn't act, and people got seriously sick, the decision was made for me when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Beautiful family you have. Would hate for anything to happen to them while you're busy playing rancher." I looked up to see Serafina smiling at me from across the field, her phone in her hand. That's when I understood that this had never been about property rights or environmental justice or even grief over her daughter's death. This was about power, control, and a woman who'd spent 3 years planning to destroy my family the same way hers had been destroyed. And tomorrow morning, 400 people were going to drink poisoned water while celebrating their victory over the selfish rancher who'd tried to stop them. The festival setup continued past midnight, with professional-grade sound equipment being installed and food trucks positioning themselves around my property like they were preparing for a county fair. Serafina had transformed her illegal camping operation into something that looked suspiciously legitimate, complete with permits that I was certain had been obtained through fraud. But as I stood there in the darkness, watching the final preparations for what was essentially a mass poisoning event, my phone rang with a call that would change everything. "Mr. Blackwater? This is Detective Maria Santos with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. We need to talk about Serafina Valdez Phoenix and what she's planning for tomorrow morning." The pieces of a much larger puzzle were about to fall into place, and what I discovered would make contaminated water look like the least of my problems. Friday morning arrived with the sound of vehicles and the kind of organized chaos that signals either a celebration or a disaster. From my kitchen window, I watched as hundreds of cars turned my quiet rural road into a festival parking lot, families with children, elderly couples in folding chairs, groups of college students with guitars, whose Serafina's social media campaign had worked beyond her wildest dreams. The transformation was complete. What had started as 15 people with expensive camping gear had evolved into something that looked like it belonged at a state park, complete with designated areas, directional signage, and enough infrastructure to support what local news was calling the largest grassroots environmental gathering in Colorado history. By 8 a.m., the crowd was everything Serafina had promised, and everything I'd feared. Someone had set up a registration booth where attendees could sign petitions and buy merchandise. Professional photographers were documenting the historic moment when the community stood up to water privatization. The media attention was extensive and immediate. Local radio stations were broadcasting live from the festival, interviewing families about why water access equality mattered to them. But the real media coup came when Serafina scored an exclusive interview with Janet Morrison from the state's most popular morning show. I found myself listening in horrified fascination as Serafina explained to a statewide audience how she'd discovered through extensive community research that my pond was historically designated for public use, and how I was using legal technicalities and intimidation tactics to prevent families from accessing clean water. The host was completely sympathetic, asking leading questions about whether there should be stronger laws to prevent water hoarding and encouraging listeners to visit the festival to stand up for community rights. Meanwhile, the actual festival activities were exactly as wholesome and family-friendly as Serafina had promised, which somehow made the whole situation even more surreal. Children were playing in the shallow end of my pond, while their parents took pictures and talked about the importance of connecting kids with nature. A local folk band was performing songs about environmental protection, while people spread picnic blankets and shared organic snacks from the food trucks. Someone had organized nature walks where volunteers explained the ecological importance of protecting community water sources from private exploitation. But while I was watching Serafina's festival reach peak attendance, my phone was buzzing with updates from Detective Santos that made my stomach drop. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation had been tracking Serafina for 8 months, following a trail of insurance fraud, property manipulation, and what they were calling grief-motivated environmental terrorism that stretched across 3 states. Luna's drowning hadn't been an accident. She'd been trying to escape from a mother whose control had become suffocating, whose grief over a previous miscarriage had transformed into an obsession with keeping her remaining child safe that bordered on imprisonment. Luna had died trying to swim away from a family camping trip that she'd begged not to attend, in a pond that Serafina had chosen specifically because it was safe and controlled. The guilt had driven Serafina to target rural communities that she blamed for not having adequate safety measures, not providing enough supervision, not protecting children the way she'd failed to protect Luna. But somewhere along the way, grief had merged with greed. Phoenix Development wasn't just about memorializing Luna. It was about making money from tragedy while satisfying Serafina's need to punish anyone who lived the kind of rural lifestyle that had claimed her daughter. Detective Santos's voice was grim when she called with the final piece of the puzzle. "Mr. Blackwater, we've been monitoring her communications. She knows exactly how contaminated that water is. She's been testing it for weeks. This isn't an accident or negligence. This is intentional bioterrorism, disguised as environmental activism." The implications were staggering. Serafina had planned this entire festival knowing that people would get sick, knowing that children could die, knowing that the resulting lawsuit and public outrage would destroy my family's ranch and allow Phoenix Development to acquire the land for practically nothing. She was using 400 innocent families as weapons in her personal war against rural America. And she was doing it while streaming the whole thing live to social media as proof of her environmental justice credentials. "Detective Santos," I said, watching children splash in contaminated water while their parents applauded Serafina's speech about community values. "How do we stop this without causing a panic that could get people trampled? We're already in position. Mr. Blackwater, but we need one more piece of evidence, a confession that proves intent. Can you get close enough to her to trigger that?" I looked across the field to where Serafina stood, on an improvised stage, addressing her crowd of devoted followers about the sacred nature of the water ceremony they were about to participate in. She was holding a wireless microphone, speaking to hundreds of people about purity and healing and community, while knowing that every word was a lie designed to cover up what amounted to mass attempted murder. But what she didn't know was that Detective Santos's team had been monitoring all radio frequencies in the area, and they were about to turn Serafina's own microphone into the instrument of her destruction. As I walked toward the stage, my phone buzzed with a final text from Detective Santos. "When you get close enough, ask her about Luna's real cause of death. Everything she says will be broadcast to everyone at the festival and recorded as evidence." The crowd parted as I approached, some people booing, others just staring with curiosity. Serafina saw me coming and smiled with the kind of confidence that comes from believing you've already won. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced into her microphone, "the man who's been trying to privatize your access to this sacred water has decided to join our celebration." The crowd's attention focused on me with laser intensity. Hundreds of phones started recording. This was either going to be my vindication or my complete destruction. Broadcast live to the internet for eternity. "Serafina," I said, loud enough for her microphone to pick up my voice. "Before these families drink that water, don't you think they deserve to know the truth about what happened to Luna?" For just a moment, her mask slipped completely. The confident environmental warrior disappeared. replaced by something raw and desperate and dangerous. And then she started talking. Luna didn't die because rural communities are unsafe, Serafina said into the microphone, her voice carrying across the festival grounds to 400 families who had come to celebrate community water rights. Luna died because she was trying to escape from me. The words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Parents stopped taking pictures. Children looked up from their pondside activities. The folk band's guitar playing faltered and died. But Serafina wasn't done. 3 years of suppressed guilt came pouring out through wireless microphone that was broadcasting her confession to everyone at the festival and recording every word as evidence. I was suffocating her, she continued, her environmental activist mask cracking completely. After I lost my first baby to miscarriage, I couldn't bear the thought of losing Luna too. I tracked her phone, monitored her friends, chose her activities, controlled everything. She begged me to let her have a normal teenage life, but I was too afraid. The crowd was silent now. Sensing that something had gone terribly wrong with their celebration, phone cameras that had been recording the water justice victory were now capturing something much darker. The night she drowned, Luna had run away from our family camping trip. She'd been planning it for weeks, saving money from her allowance, researching bus schedules. She died in that pond because she was trying to swim across to the road where she could catch a ride to her grandmother's house. She died because living with my fear had become worse than risking death. Detective Santos and her team were moving through the crowd now. But Serafina was too lost in her confession to notice. For 3 years, I've been telling myself that rural communities killed my daughter because they don't have enough safety measures, enough supervision, enough protection. But the truth is, I killed her with my need to control everything. And instead of dealing with that guilt, I decided to make other families pay for my failure as a mother. She turned to look directly at me, and what I saw in her eyes was terrifying. Not grief or anger, but something cold and calculating that had been wearing grief as a mask. You want to know why I chose your ranch, Caspian? Because your daughter Willow is the same age Luna was when she died. Because you're a widower raising a teenager alone, just like I was. Because I wanted to watch you lose everything the way I did. The confession that followed made everyone at the festival understand exactly what they'd been participating in. Serafina detailed how she'd been planning this for 18 months, researching my family's personal tragedy, studying my property, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I knew this water was contaminated, she said, gesturing toward the pond where children had been playing minutes earlier. I had it tested weeks ago. E. coli levels 400 times the safe limit. Parasites that could cause kidney failure. I've been watching families let their children drink poison for 8 days. And I documented every moment for the lawsuit that would destroy the Blackwater Ranch. Parents were pulling their children out of the water now. Horror replacing celebration as they realized what they'd been exposed to. But Serafina wasn't finished. Phoenix Development has been waiting to purchase this land for a luxury resort since Luna died. 800 acres worth $50 million that we plan to acquire for $5 million after the contamination lawsuit and criminal charges destroyed the current owner. Every sick child, every hospitalized family member, every news story about the rancher who poisoned an environmental festival, it was all part of the business plan. Detective Santos stepped onto the makeshift stage, her badge visible as she approached the microphone. Serafina Valdez Phoenix. You're under arrest for conspiracy, bioterrorism, fraud, and reckless endangerment. The crowd erupted into chaos as the reality of the situation hit home. Parents were screaming about their children's exposure to contaminated water. Environmental activists who'd traveled hundreds of miles to support the cause were realizing they'd been manipulated into participating in a criminal conspiracy. Media crews who'd come to cover a feel-good story about community activism were now documenting what appeared to be domestic terrorism. But Serafina's breakdown wasn't over. As Detective Santos placed her in handcuffs, she continued talking into the microphone that was still live. "You all wanted to feel good about yourselves by supporting environmental justice," she said, her voice filled with venom. "You wanted to believe you were protecting community resources from greedy ranchers. But you were just props in my revenge fantasy. Every one of you who brought children to drink contaminated water, every parent who took pictures of kids playing in a bacterial soup, you did it because I told you it would make you righteous." The festival grounds had become a crime scene. Emergency medical teams were setting up triage areas for people who might have consumed contaminated water. Environmental health inspectors were taking samples and establishing quarantine protocols. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation was cordoning off areas and beginning interviews with witnesses, but the most damaging evidence was still playing through the sound system as Detective Santos's team downloaded the recorded confession from Serafina's own microphone. Dr. Roy Patterson arrived with a mobile veterinary lab and immediately began explaining to concerned parents exactly what E. coli contamination could do to the human body. His professional, measured delivery of medical facts created its own kind of horror as families realized the scope of what they'd been exposed to. E. coli levels this high can cause severe dehydration, kidney damage, and in young children or elderly adults, potentially death. He explained to a crowd that had gone dead silent. Anyone who consumed water from this pond or had extended skin contact needs immediate medical evaluation. The exodus was swift and chaotic. 800 cars trying to leave a rural area simultaneously, while emergency vehicles tried to get in, created traffic jams that would take hours to resolve. But more problematic was the developing medical crisis as people who'd consumed pond water over the past week began experiencing symptoms. Willow found me in the chaos, her face pale, but her voice steady. "Dad, I recorded everything on my phone, not just what happened on stage, but I've been documenting their activities for days. Every conversation, every planning meeting, every moment when Serafina knew people were drinking contaminated water and encouraged them to continue. My daughter had inherited her mother's investigative instincts and her generation's technological expertise. While I'd been focused on property rights and legal battles, she'd been building a comprehensive case against Serafina's criminal enterprise. I also found the insurance policies," she continued. "Phoenix Development took out $50 million in environmental liability coverage on our ranch 6 months ago. They were planning to sue themselves through a shell company after the contamination event, collect the insurance money, and use the funds to purchase the property at bankruptcy prices. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking. This wasn't just about revenge or grief or even environmental activism. This was about a sophisticated financial fraud scheme that used environmental justice as camouflage and hundreds of innocent families as unwitting participants. Detective Santos approached us as the last of the festival attendees were being processed through medical screening. "Mr. Blackwater, we're going to need your full cooperation over the next several weeks. But I want you to know that our investigation has cleared you of any wrongdoing. In fact, your restraint in not forcibly removing these people probably prevented a much worse outcome." She paused, looking across the field where my contaminated pond sat surrounded by hazmat tape and warning signs. Serafina had backup plans if you tried to shut down the festival early. Planted evidence that would have made you look like you were trying to cover up environmental crimes. False witnesses prepared to testify that you'd threatened violence. She wanted you to react aggressively so she could paint you as the dangerous rural extremist in her narrative. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and comprehensive. Serafina's recorded confession, combined with Willow's documentation and the CBI's months-long investigation, created an ironclad case that even her high-powered attorneys couldn't challenge. Phoenix Development's insurance fraud scheme unraveled completely when investigators discovered they'd attempted similar operations in Utah and Wyoming, targeting rural landowners whose properties had development potential. The environmental activism angle was just the most recent evolution of their tactics. Marcus Ravencroft, the attorney who'd threatened me with legal action, he was arrested 3 days later when investigators proved his law license had been suspended for 18 months and he'd been operating as an unlicensed legal representative while taking money from Phoenix Development. The fake tribal elders who'd provided testimonials about the pond's sacred status turned out to be unemployed actors from Denver who'd been paid $500 each to read scripts that Serafina had written. The historical documents claiming community water rights were expertly forged, created by a document fraud operation that had been supplying Phoenix Development with fake paperwork for over 2 years. But the most disturbing revelation came when investigators examined Serafina's personal communications and discovered that the contamination plan wasn't her first attempt at revenge against rural communities. Over the past 3 years, she'd been responsible for at least 6 other incidents involving ranches and farms across Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming, environmental violations that appeared to be regulatory oversights but were actually sabotage, equipment failures that looked like accidents but were deliberate destruction, insurance claims that seemed legitimate but were carefully orchestrated fraud. Luna's death had transformed her mother into something predatory and systematic. Someone who used environmental activism and corporate development as weapons against anyone who represented the rural lifestyle she blamed for her daughter's drowning. The trial was covered extensively by national media, partly because of the environmental terrorism angle, but mostly because of how completely Serafina's recorded confession had documented her own criminal enterprise. Legal experts called it one of the most thoroughly self-incriminating pieces of evidence they'd ever seen in a federal courtroom. Judge Patricia Hendricks, a 20-year veteran of the federal bench whose own family had run cattle in eastern Colorado, delivered a sentence that reflected both the severity of the crimes and the judge's understanding of what was at stake. Mrs. Valdez Phoenix, you have been found guilty of conspiracy, racketeering, bioterrorism, fraud, and endangering the welfare of children. Your crimes weren't motivated by environmental concern or community activism, but by a desire for revenge that was so consuming, you were willing to poison 400 innocent people to satisfy it. 28 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 15 years. Phoenix Development was dissolved and its assets liquidated, with the proceeds going to a victim compensation fund for affected families and medical treatment for anyone who'd suffered health consequences from the contaminated water. But for me, the most meaningful part of the resolution came when Judge Hendricks announced that our ranch would be designated as a protected agricultural heritage site, ensuring that future generations would be able to witness sustainable ranching practices that had been refined over 4 generations. Dr. Patterson was hired as the state's new agricultural water safety inspector, his principles and expertise finally receiving the recognition they deserved. Detective Santos received a commendation for her investigation, which had prevented what environmental terrorism experts called a potential mass casualty event. The aftermath brought changes that rippled far beyond Colorado's borders. The case became required study material at law enforcement academies, a textbook example of how domestic terrorism could hide behind social justice movements and corporate development schemes. Environmental groups across the country implemented new verification protocols for grassroots activism, recognizing that their legitimate causes could be exploited by bad actors with personal agendas. Federal agencies strengthened protections for agricultural properties, acknowledging that food production infrastructure was a potential target for those who wanted to damage rural communities. But the most important change happened right here on our ranch. Willow and I installed proper fencing around the pond and established an educational program where visitors could learn about sustainable livestock management and water safety protocols. The program became popular with agricultural universities and environmental studies programs, creating an unexpected income stream that helped us recover from the legal expenses and property damage caused by Serafina's festival. More importantly, it gave us a way to turn trauma into education, helping other families understand the difference between legitimate environmental concerns and manipulative activism designed to serve hidden agendas. Standing in the same field where Serafina's followers had celebrated their environmental justice victory while drinking contaminated water, I realized that her greatest mistake had been underestimating the power of truth and the determination of people who refused to be victims. She'd brought social media warfare, legal manipulation, and corporate fraud to a fight that was really about honesty, community, and the unbreakable bond between land and family. Money and manipulation are formidable weapons, but they're no match for integrity, backed by evidence and supported by justice. The pond that had been the centerpiece of Serafina's revenge scheme was eventually cleaned and restored to its original purpose, providing safe, clean water for our livestock. But we added a memorial plaque near the fence, not for Serafina or her crimes, but for Luna, a 14-year-old girl whose death had been used to justify terrible things she never would have wanted. In memory of Luna Valdez, taken too soon by tragedy, remembered not for how she died, but for the life she wanted to live. Every morning when I walk out to check on the cattle, I think about the difference between grief that heals and grief that destroys. Serafina chose to honor her daughter's death by nearly killing other people's children. But healing was always possible. She just chose revenge instead. Willow's social media accounts became platforms for education about water safety, environmental fraud, and the importance of verifying information before joining movements that claim to represent justice. Her Generation, raised on digital literacy and skeptical thinking, became our best defense against the kind of manipulation that Serafina had used so effectively. The ranch is quiet now, the way it was before Serafina's invasion. My cattle graze peacefully in the morning light, their ancient rhythms undisturbed by human drama. The pond serves its intended purpose, supporting the animals that have thrived on this land for 4 generations. Sometimes the good guys do win, but only when they're willing to fight for what's right. Document the truth, and never give up hope that justice will eventually prevail. Serafina thought she could buy her way to redemption through the destruction of others, but she learned the hard way that some things can't be purchased, corrupted, or destroyed. The land remembers, the truth endures, and sometimes, if you're very fortunate and very determined, justice does triumph over evil. If this story of manipulation disguised as activism resonated with you, I hope you'll share it with others who need to understand how environmental causes can be weaponized by people with hidden agendas. Your comments and support help these important stories reach families who might be facing similar situations. Remember that the most passionate activists might sometimes be the most dangerous predators, and the most beautiful causes can hide the ugliest motives. Trust, but verify. Question everything, and never let anyone use your compassion as a weapon against innocent people. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay informed, and remember that justice delayed is not always justice denied. The ripple effects of Serafina's crimes continued long after her sentencing. 8 months later, I received a call from Dr. James Whitfield, an epidemiologist with the Centers for Disease Control, who'd been studying what he called environmentally motivated bioterrorism, using our case as a primary example. Mr. Blackwater, what happened at your ranch wasn't an isolated incident. He explained during our phone conversation. We've identified at least 12 similar cases across 7 states where environmental activism was used as cover for intentional contamination events. Your daughter's documentation helped us establish the behavioral patterns we're now using to prevent future attacks. Willow's social media investigation techniques had become part of federal training protocols for identifying fake grassroots movements. Her ability to trace digital footprints, verify credentials, and expose coordinated disinformation campaigns was being taught to law enforcement agencies nationwide. "Dad," she told me one evening as we watched the sunset from our back porch, "I've been thinking about what Mom would say about all this." Sarah had been a teacher before cancer took her. Someone who believed deeply in environmental protection, but also in critical thinking and evidence-based decision-making. She would have been horrified by how Serafina corrupted legitimate environmental concerns to serve personal vendettas. She'd say that the best way to honor real environmental causes is to protect them from people who want to exploit them. I replied, "And she'd be proud of how you use technology to expose the truth instead of spreading lies." The educational program we'd established had grown beyond anything I'd imagined. Universities from across the country were sending students to study not just sustainable ranching practices, but media literacy, community organizing, and the difference between genuine activism and manipulative campaigns. Dr. Patterson had developed a curriculum that was being adopted by agricultural colleges nationwide, teaching farmers and ranchers how to recognize and respond to coordinated attacks on their operations. The program included legal resources, media strategies, and community-building techniques that helped rural families defend themselves without becoming isolated or paranoid. One of the most powerful aspects of our program was the victim advocacy component. Families who'd been exposed to contaminated water at Serafina's festival spoke to visitors about their experiences, helping others understand how psychological manipulation works and why people fall for sophisticated fraud schemes. "We weren't stupid," explained Maria Gonzalez, whose 3 children had been hospitalized after consuming pond water. "We were caring people who wanted to support environmental justice. Serafina exploited our values against us. And that's something everyone needs to understand can happen to anyone." The legal precedents established by Serafina's case were being used to prosecute similar crimes across the country. Environmental terrorism charges that had previously been reserved for obviously malicious acts like oil spills or chemical dumping were now being applied to cases where activists deliberately created health hazards while claiming to protect the environment. Federal agencies had also strengthened verification requirements for environmental permits and protest activities. The fake documents that Serafina had used so effectively were now much harder to produce and easier to detect, thanks to blockchain verification systems and interagency databases that cross-referenced permits with legitimate government records. But perhaps the most important change was happening in rural communities themselves. The isolation and vulnerability that Serafina had exploited were being addressed through better communication networks, shared legal resources, and community education programs that helped farmers and ranchers support each other when facing organized attacks. Our local sheriff's department had established a rural crime task force specifically designed to investigate cases where property disputes might involve fraud, manipulation, or outside coordination. They'd already prevented 3 similar schemes in neighboring counties. Using the investigation techniques developed during Serafina's case, as I finished writing this account, I realized that Serafina's most lasting legacy might be the opposite of what she intended. Instead of destroying trust in rural communities and environmental activism, her crimes had forced both sides to become more honest, more careful, and more committed to protecting legitimate causes from those who would exploit them. The pond where her festival took place has been restored to its natural function, supporting healthy livestock on land that continues to produce food for surrounding communities. Children still visit as part of our educational program, but now they learn about water safety, media literacy, and the importance of verifying information before supporting causes that claim to represent justice. Willow graduated early and received a full scholarship to study digital forensics and environmental law. She wants to become the kind of investigator who can identify and stop schemes like Serafina's before they hurt innocent people. Her generation understands that protecting the environment and protecting communities from exploitation aren't competing goals. They're the same fight. Every morning, as I watch my cattle drink from clean water under open skies, I'm reminded that the best defense against manipulation is education. The best response to lies is truth, and the best way to honor tragedy is to prevent it from happening to others. Serafina thought she could use grief and environmental rhetoric to destroy our community. Instead, she taught us to be stronger, smarter, and more united in protecting both our land and our values from those who would corrupt them for personal gain.